Hello, everybody. Welcome to this new event for the Writer Summit. Thank you all so much for being here. Just to introduce the Writer Summit again, we are a new student-founded organization with the aim to bring insightful conversation with writers and journalists to an audience on social media often who have not had access to these kind of discussions before. So we not only want to offer the opportunity for aspiring writers to also showcase their work, we also want to offer individuals the chance to interview our eminent and often highly regarded guests. So with that in mind, I'd really like to welcome today's guest, Professor Emma Smith. Thank you so much for being here. I believe she's here. Yes, she is. Great. Thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to have you with us. Professor Emma Smith is a lecturer in English at the University of Oxford, Professor of Shakespeare Studies and a Fellow of Hertford College. And she's here today to discuss her Sunday Times bestseller book, This is Shakespeare. So how the event will work today, I will begin with a more brief discussion of some of the themes and motivations of the book, and then I will pass on to our guest interviewer for today, Sarah Rourke, who will drill down and ask questions on the chapter of Macbeth in particular. Each chapter of the book focuses on a different play, so she's going to particularly focus on Macbeth. And then after that, we'll then give way to a Q&A. So please, throughout the event, be thinking of questions you'd like to ask. And please send them on the chat, either to myself or Sarah, or on the main chat as well. But of course, that won't be anonymous in terms of we can see your name. So yeah, without further ado, once again, thank Emma for being here, and we'll kick off the conversation. So I'd really like to first ask, as a means of introduction, in the introduction to your book, you answered the question, why should we read this book about Shakespeare, or why should we read any book about Shakespeare? That's the very beginning of the book. I'd like to slightly invert that question and ask, what would we fundamentally lose as students or as a society if we stopped reading Shakespeare and stopped trying to understand Shakespeare?
Hi, Luke. Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for having me. It's a really interesting sort of counterfactual in a way, isn't it? Because so much of our literary study, rhetorical study, quite a lot of, sort of political engagement, lots of these things are actually shaped by Shakespeare's very interesting argument about whether, in some complicated ways, Shakespeare offers a kind of template, a racialized template in Othello that has actually affected behavior and attitudes and all kinds of things ever since. So it's a difficult thing to think, what would it be like? What would it be like without Shakespeare? I suppose if we stopped, sometimes I think it wouldn't be a bad idea to stop right now and have a bit of a break and then maybe come back to it. That's sometimes called for in the theatre. Every now and again, a director says, let's have a moratorium on Shakespeare productions for a while, and then we can just sort of come back and see them afresh. But I think if we stopped, if Shakespeare had never been, lots of things about our culture would be different. If we stopped studying Shakespeare, I think we would miss out on an extraordinary, rich, sometimes problematic, but global kind of cultural idea. There are problems about Shakespeare's global reach, but he's probably pretty much the only English language author who has that. So I think we would be missing something quite substantial.
So thank you. What personally drew you to writing this book? Was it just Shakespeare's sheer importance, or the other factors as well?
Well, as you introduced this as being a forum for writers, I mean, I partly wrote this book in a way because I was asked to write it. I was invited to write it. So if you write an academic book to be published by an academic press, really you pitch to them, this is my idea, this is my thesis, this is why you should publish this book. But more often, if you're writing a trade book, there might be a bit more of a conversation where the trade editor says, we would like to publish a kind of general book on Shakespeare for a general reader. Would you be interested in doing that? I had Underpinning this book is a series of lectures that I had given to students in Oxford, which had been recorded. And the editor had heard a couple of those and said, something like that would work for us. So the sort of immediate reason why did I write it was because I got the opportunity to do that. And I got the opportunity to think about what might a book on Shakespeare look like in the 21st century, that is aimed at people who are interested but not professionally involved in it.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, Shakespeare does have such a wide appeal, at least so many people know Shakespeare because we still study it at school pretty much. And I guess I'd like to kind of ask one or two questions about that. In the blurb of your book, it's argued immediately straight away that a lot of what we're taught about Shakespeare is either not true or just not relevant. And you even say in the introduction, I think that iambic pentameter is not particularly important, which I remember learning loads of lessons about iambic pentameter at school. So I wonder your opinion. What do you think is fundamentally going wrong with the teaching of Shakespeare at school, and how can we go about improving it?
I think that's a tough question. I don't have to teach Shakespeare in school. And I admire people who do. I think there's a lot of very good teaching of Shakespeare in school. I think, though, that I actually slightly wonder whether there's a bit too much Shakespeare in school. There's a bit too much Shakespeare when it's at a time when you don't really have the resources to enjoy it. Perhaps you don't get to go to the theatre, or you don't get to see it in different. You don't get to see it perform, perhaps. So maybe we shouldn't be so hung up on Shakespeare as the thing that everybody must do at school. And maybe we shouldn't. I think we're very contradictory about what we say about Shakespeare. On the one hand, we say Shakespeare is sort of relevant to everybody, and we always trot out the idea he wrote for the masses, not for the elite. But then in the way that we talk about Shakespeare, we tend to intervene certain kinds of terms or understandings that reinstate Shakespeare as something elite. And I feel as if iambic pentameter is one of those. I mean, of course, iambic pentameter is sort of important, but not really. I mean, I don't get that. I don't see that it's the key that unlocks things. Once you know it, what do you know? And in fact, iambic pentameter is a good example. Once you know it, you think what's interesting is when Shakespeare breaks it. So in itself, it's a kind of boring kind of background. So I was interested in, we tend to think you need to know a lot about kings, or you need to know a lot about history, or of course you need to know the context of this or that. And I slightly wanted to brush that away and to say, maybe there's a way of thinking about Shakespeare where you don't need to know about that, but what you could know about is, I don't know, problems around consent, or you might know about fake news or something. So I tried to think about things that people did know about and were experts in, and to attach Shakespeare to that, rather than always attaching Shakespeare to a whole lot of other stuff you need to know before you can get into it.
And do you think not only at school, but also at universities, the teaching of Shakespeare or the discussion of Shakespeare could benefit from broadening that conversation away from the sort of more traditional routes to the iambic pentameter and the like?
Well, what I actually think about iambic pentameter is it's a thing of the classroom, mostly of the past, although your experience would suggest not the very far away past. And I think that lots of teaching that's happening in universities and around the place is actually really interesting, and is very interested in a kind of a more contemporary Shakespeare or a more performance Shakespeare or something. So I'm not at all pitching into that sphere and saying everybody's doing it wrong. I suppose I am saying that the sort of more general kind of public apprehension of Shakespeare tends to be that there is a real meaning, and then you might sort of riff on it, or you might invent something. So one of the first chapters in my book is about Taming of the Shrew. And I suppose in that I was trying to say, I don't think it's that The Taming of the Shrew is a really sexist play, that you could perform in a way which challenged that, so that there's a sort of standard view and then you could do something wild and wacky with it. I think it's a deeply ambivalent play, and I tried to bring out that as a way of thinking about Shakespeare more generally. So although it's been really great to talk with people who have read this book as part of a course or part of sort of formal Shakespeare study, I don't think I wrote it with that audience particularly in mind.
Yeah, you also talk in your introduction about the ambiguity of characters in Shakespeare's plays. You mentioned Hamlet being played by Mel Gibson and then being played by Benedict Cumberbatch, and how the differences of their characters and how they appear and all the like inform our own take on the play. And you point out that we do not know that these what these famous characters necessarily look like. So I'm really curious, what would you say to various elements of typically, say, the right-wing press, who sometimes stir up debate when, for example, a woman plays Prospero in The Tempest, which is what Alex Kingston's doing at the moment, or when a Black woman plays Richard III. Do you think that these castings help us give a new perspective on these plays?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are there are two things there. One is that the sort of importance of Shakespeare culturally means that his works are always going to be this kind of football. They're a kind of proxy for culture wars of different sorts. And that if you can say, oh, this is happening to Shakespeare, you're saying, you know, you're making a sort of exemplary claim, aren't you, about the way the arts are full of lefties, or, you know, everything's going to hell in a handcart. So I think Shakespeare's role in those debates is actually really interesting. And the anxiety around Shakespeare, the kind of Shakespeare and race work which is being done at the Globe Theatre in London, which I think is very interesting, but is very, very unsettling to certain elements of the press. It seems to me there are two things going on. One is about who is allowed to do Shakespeare. And there's been a long history of, you know, received pronunciation, educated, highly educated, mostly men, performing these roles with a lot of rules about how you manage. I mean, iambic pentameter is not to hark on about that, since I don't think it's important. It would be a bit ironic to spend all the time talking about it. But I mean, iambic pentameter was a really big deal for the classic period of the Royal Shakespeare Company, for instance. You know, and you can do all kinds of amazing exercises with actors, which are all about the kind of beat of the line and everything. They were really, really into it as a kind of key to it. So they had a strong sense, this is how you speak verse, this is how Shakespeare should sound, and this is how Shakespeare should look. And I think the challenge to that is, you know, we don't look like that, and we don't sound like that. And so these recastings are important in changing Shakespeare, and they're important in changing who can voice these lines, who can inhabit these characters. And since we don't, as you say, we don't know, I mean, we do know that Prospero was probably not played by a woman, but we don't know, you know, Shakespeare isn't like certain modern playwrights. It's not writing in a way which describes, you know, characters physically or something. So I think it's, I don't have a, not only do I not have a problem with it, I enjoy it. I think those examples that you've given, the recent Tempest, the Richard II at the Globe, have been fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, another social issue to do with Shakespeare perhaps is there's a discussion about whether we study too many works coming from a male perspective versus a female perspective. And I know Virginia Woolf wrote about a hypothetical sister of Shakespeare, and she argued that essentially in a 16th century English society, sort of a female equivalent of Shakespeare would not have been able to succeed. Her talents would have been hostilely received. Do you agree with this perspective? I wonder, is there a fundamental absence of sort of female perspective 16th century literature because of it?
Yeah, no, I don't think there's a fundamental absence at all. I mean, there are lots of genres in which women write very extensively in this period, particularly in poetry and translations. The first sonnets are by a woman, Anne Locke. There are, you know, prose pieces. There are all kinds of genres that we didn't used to value, like mother's advice books and kind of recipe books and that kind of thing, which were, and letters that we're coming to understand as kind of important textual artifacts. So there's a huge amount of women's writing in the period. I think that Shakespeare's I think two slightly contradictory things about Shakespeare here. Sometimes I think we ask too much of Shakespeare. We are invested in him and in the sort of timelessness of his works in ways which make us overclaim things about how modern he is, or how liberal he is, or how much he's aligned with modern perspectives, and gender might be one place for that. But on the other hand, I've been very struck by the number of women actors who have written really interestingly about characters originally written for male actors, young male actors, and saying, you know, how extraordinarily, authentic they have found the voice that Shakespeare gives those characters. There's a famous quote by Janet Suzman who says, "I just can't believe that Cleopatra was written for a boy. It just can't be right." So I think there is some room in Shakespeare to find other kinds of perspectives. I don't think everything is from, I think to write a successful play, you have to be able to imagine what it's like to be someone else. And that's something which I think Shakespeare often does very well. But we can't, sometimes we do overtax him maybe.
Okay, that's fascinating. I'd love to hand over now to Sarah, I guess, interviewer. Thank you for my.
Hi, thank you. Oh yeah. Hi Emma, it's lovely to meet you. My first question for you is, I know you've recently written another book, Portable Magic, where you discuss the significance of a book as a material object. And today we read Shakespeare both in like book form or on a screen. Like, for example, I read Hamlet last week on my laptop. And I guess my question is, how does the medium through which we read Shakespeare affect our experience?
It's a really great question. I guess the example that's in my mind, because of the year, is the first folio, the first collected edition of Shakespeare's plays, which comes out in 1623. So we've got a number of activities for its 400th birthday. And the folio is a really important point in the history of Shakespeare, Shakespeare's reputation, Shakespeare's kind of afterlife. So a folio is a big book, sort of foolscap size, like a big Bible or something. And it's a big thick book. It's got 36 plays in it, 900 pages. It's a big weighty book. And it's the comparison point is what we call quartos, which are individual plays printed in a sort of pamphlet, effectively, a pamphlet of about 40 pages. And they're small in size, they're the sort of size of a paperback book or something, but without the sort of much thinner and flimsier. And something really important happens to Shakespeare because of and through that big format, the folio format. I think he becomes a writer to read rather than to see primarily on the stage. So there's an attempt to think about him as someone to study rather than to sort of encounter in performance. I think it tries to push Shakespeare sort of upmarket and to get away from the negative associations of performed theatre. And I think it suggests, just because the book form itself is so durable compared with quartos, that this is work that's going to last, that you're still going to be interested in 100 years or 200 years. So that's hugely different from reading a kind of throwaway, almost newspaper format, copy of Hamlet or something. And in fact, we know it's hugely different because the first edition of Hamlet, 1603, there's no single complete copy. There are two-part copies from which we get a sense of what the whole thing was. So these were books that were just kind of read to bits or lost or recycled or something, whereas we've got 234 or 5 copies of the first folio. So I think that's a really interesting example of how format makes a real practical difference to writer survival, but also places them culturally in quite distinct ways.
Yeah, thank you. And on a similar thread, your title of the book, This is Shakespeare, is a quite definitive, almost resolute sounding title. And I wondered why, although I know it might be an almost impossible task to include everything, the sonnets are completely removed from this, and sort of what makes approaching plays and sonnets by Shakespeare so different.
So yeah, two things. I mean, the title, you're absolutely right about the title. I'm just going to shut the door so the dog doesn't come back in.
No problem.
My dog has learned to open doors, which everybody thinks is very sweet, but is actually rather
impressive.
So the title, I think you're right. The title is much more emphatic than I would have gone for. Again, that's a slightly publisher's nudge. And I try and parry it a bit at the beginning of the book to say, this is Shakespeare, and the Shakespeare that I'm talking about is kind of multiple and playful and fluid and ambiguous rather than fixed. But yeah, I kind of take the point about the title. I mostly picked a combination of plays. The Shakespeare that I'm writing about is a playwright, and that's part of what's important about the kind of ambiguity and possibility is specifically performance led. And the Shakespeare I'm most comfortable with is actually a playwright rather than a lyric poet. So I didn't include the sonnets, although I have written on them elsewhere. And there are a number of plays that I didn't include, partly because I thought they were not, I needed a balance between sort of well-known and less well-known plays. You think when you're talking about Shakespeare that everything is well-known, but in fact, really, only about 5 or 6 plays have recognition outside, quite specialist kind of readers. And so I needed to kind of balance that out. So there are some that I really regret that I didn't include. In the lecture series that I already mentioned, there's a lecture on Pericles, which I really like, and it's one of my favorite. And I would have liked to have had that in the book, but I didn't.
Yeah. Talking of the lecture series where they originate, I know they were originally only intended for your students, but I'm very glad they're out there because they're very informative as an English student. But what I wanted to ask was, through forming the lectures and also through creating the book, was it difficult to sort of funnel the plays through sort of one central question, or did they come naturally? Sort of how in Macbeth you discuss agency as the sort of way to look at the play.
Yeah, and if you're interested in the, if you've heard any of the lectures, you'll know that it's very prominent that there is one question, and that's how the lecture is structured. Some of those questions slightly disappear a bit in the book, so that you can see that they're there if you know that they're there, but they're not. The chapters are not organized most of them are not organized in quite that same way. I found the questions actually really relatively easy to come to and quite liberating, because it's about sort of seeming to try to simplify and to cut through what's a huge amount of material. I think everybody who has to write an essay or study Shakespeare or work on Shakespeare feels a bit overwhelmed by how much has already been done. It seemed quite a good way just to cut through and think, lots of these things are all asking the different versions of the same question. And if we start with that, that might be a good way to go.
Yes, certainly. I know when reading your Measure for Measure chapter, that's how it felt. It felt like all it sort of does relate to genre that's kind of intrinsic to the play. So if we're thinking about Macbeth as a play, one of the most famous and well-known Shakespeare plays, undoubtedly, it's still staged and put on in cinemas frequently. How would you say Macbeth resonates today?
I think lots of the things that people have been interested in Macbeth are about sort of understanding the motivation of the central couple, that they're a couple who seem to require a kind of psychological or even a psychoanalytic sort of fleshing out. So I think there's been a lot of interest in character. There's an interest clearly in sort of violence, brutality, those kinds of themes, and in the cost of that sort of trauma, battle trauma, all those things. So I think there's a resonance of Macbeth which is sort of broadly political and one which is broadly psychological. And I guess finally, I mean, in the psychology, I would think about Lady Macbeth, but there's a sort of feminist revisioning of the play, I guess, by lots of directors, particularly, who are trying to think again about a character who has been so vilified by the sort of popular perception of her, and to think again about her role.
Yeah. So some people, or some scholars, I should say, have talked about Macbeth not so much as a political tragedy, but as a domestic tragedy. Where do you lie on that issue?
So I suppose what I'm trying to do throughout the book is to bring a sense that that the plays generate these questions, and that the idea that Macbeth is domestic, either in positive ways or in negative ways, has been a long part of its critical history. Dr. Johnson felt that the phrase, let not the blanket of the dark see my deep and dark desires, whatever, and he said the word blanket there is just ridiculous. You know, blanket is what you have in a sort of baby's cot. It's not what you have in a tragedy. And so there's a kind of language of the domestic, which for some critics has been a reductive element. And then I guess for others, there's been a sense that this play draws, interestingly, on the generic history of so-called domestic tragedies, which were sort of bourgeois household tragedies, usually turning on women's unfaithfulness or something, plays like Arden of Faversham or A Woman Killed with Kindness, and that it builds, it builds that. So I think, in the Elizabethan Jacobean period, the domestic space was often thought about as a political space with a small p, and there was as many people will know, a kind of analogical system which said, as the subject is to the king, and the wife is to the husband, so is the servant to the master, and these are all interlocking forms of order, and they're all, thrown up in the air. They're all disordered in the play.
Yeah. I also wanted to draw our attention to the famous tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow speech, and I'll just read out the last line for the audience. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. It's a nihilistic speech, to put it lightly, and it made me think, is there a risk of over-interpreting Shakespeare?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there is a risk of over-interpreting. I'm thinking that I've got a line of my I've got a colleague who's working a lot on the on moral fiction, novelists who are moral, and he keeps quoting this bit of from Iris Murdoch, from the novelist Iris Murdoch, who I've hardly read, which is that attention is a form of love. Attention is a form of love. And he's always talking about that in terms of sort of critical attention, looking at something in a lot of detail, even if that's a text or a line, or if it's, someone's cheek while they're asleep, or, whatever level of kind of, it's a kind of intimacy, and it's a kind of care, it's kind of love. And I think that's a different sort of set of metaphorical associations to bring to the act of close reading. There's always the sense that you're sort of going too far, but there's another sense that you are spending sort of mindful time thinking as hard as you can, or as intently as you can, or as lovingly as you can about the object. Having said that, yeah, of course we can all go too far, and you would have people have different I suppose people have different barriers about that. You know, there are some people who work in the theatre who say if an interpretation is something you couldn't convey in the theatre, then it's useless or it's gone too far. I'm interested in how you put the question together with the quotation. Were you thinking that the quotation sort of doesn't need any? It's sort of all there. It's over the top to try and to analyze it as well. Was that sort of how you're?
Well, I think there was, I guess, a kind of irony in the way I composed that question, because what I get from Macbeth's speech is that it, told by an idiot full of sounds and fury signifying nothing, is that Macbeth is declaring life meaningless and therefore is overinterpreting words on a page.
Yeah, and everything about the play suggests it's absolutely not meaningless, isn't it? So I mean, there are lots of, one of the interesting things about Shakespeare's lines is how they're actually situated, and whether the person who delivers them or the context in which they're delivered is sort of endorsing them or undercutting them. And it's interesting to think that. I've just been thinking quite a lot about Macbeth because I was just reading Zinnie Harris's script of her reworking of the play, which is on in Edinburgh at the moment, which I'm going to go and see at the weekend. And it just made me think about the bit when Macbeth sort of discovers or is told that, of course, or he already knows that Duncan is dead. And he has a great speech at that point, which is part of which is the wine of life is drunk and there's nothing left but the lees. You know, it's not unlike tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. I mean, it's the same point of saying it's all for nothing. So I don't know how tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow looks when we've heard something quite similar that was fake, that was put on existential rather than real existential, and whether all that sort of meta theatricality slightly places it in quotation marks. I don't know.
No, yeah, definitely. It is to be questioned how sincere Macbeth even is at that moment in the play. Yeah. So if we're going to take a return to, I'd say, interpreting, I was thinking about some of like the, oh gosh, I'm going to say this, the neologisms in the play, particularly made up by Macbeth. And if this vocabulary, in a sense, is indicative of him taking responsibility because he finds a situation sort of incomprehensible to put into normal words, or what you think about Shakespeare using neologisms more generally.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a sort of, I think most neologisms are by male characters, and I think there is a sort of male, an attempt by those characters to process something that is beyond their understanding, and that's usually when there's a sense that Shakespeare's making up a new word, but that also the character knows that this is a kind of extreme word, or when Shakespeare's characters speak in a very Latinate way, they're usually being evasive or not quite able to say what it is they mean. They're doing it, it's a part of their characterization. So yeah, I think it's a really good point about neologisms, that they, but whether it's a way of taking responsibility or not taking responsibility, I think you could probably argue either way. So when Macbeth talks about the multitudinous scenes in Carnarvon, which is one of the examples that's very often given, in Carnarvon, make red, is he so horrified by what he's done that he can only talk about it in this way? Or is he actually completely evading what he's done by sort of beautifying or distancing it through that kind of language? I don't know.
Yeah. I'd say to round off the questions, I had one of real personal interest, and that was, what is your opinion on modern adaptations of Shakespeare, but ones that stray quite far away from the original source? So I'm thinking sort of like along the lines of chick flicks, for example, that are inspired by Shakespeare.
I think some are good and some are not good, but I don't think they're, in some ways, their relationship to Shakespeare, they're often better the further away from Shakespeare they are. So I think if you're going to adapt Shakespeare, you've got to have the confidence to do it. And I feel that actually about productions more generally, productions that aren't adaptations. I admire it often when directors cut plays, cut them intelligently, and cut them with a sense of knowing what they want to do with them, or rework them in some way. So I don't think Shakespeare needs protecting from creative encounters with his works. And one good thing about Shakespeare's ubiquity is that there'll be a kind of ordinary one along before too long. So if you're worried about Romeo and Juliet or something, the garden gnomes doing Romeo and Juliet, you've only got a few minutes to be annoyed before a straight, as it were, Romeo and Juliet will come along. So yeah, I'm for it. I'm absolutely for it.
Great. And it sounds like you're going to spend your weekend watching a very enjoyable adaptation of Shakespeare. And I was wondering, for our audience members and for myself, could you just recommend one that has stayed with you recently or is particularly impactful that we should spend our weekend having a look at?
Good question. So I liked Joel Cohen's Macbeth, which he made, which was on Apple TV for a while. I don't know where it is now. If you can get a 3-day free pass to Apple TV, as far as I could see, there was nothing else you would want to watch on Apple TV, but maybe there is. So Joel Cohen's film with Frances McDormand as Lady Macbeth and Catherine Hunter as the witches, I think is the film that's in my mind. But I'm working on Twelfth Night, and I just watched again She's the Man, and thought, yeah, there's lots of interesting things to think about. What this film can't do. This film about the girl who wants to be in the boys' football team, so she does the kind of Twelfth Night thing. There's lots of ways in which this film sort of flags up some of the ways the play is odd or ahead of its time. More comfortable with sort of less heteronormative maybe than the High School movie. So yeah, either serious, the Cohen Macbeth, or not so, She's the Man.
Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. I think that takes us to the Q&A. Thank you so much. So yeah, please do send in your questions while I ask the first, which is, in Othello, do you think Shakespeare is criticizing the racist attitudes of the time, or is he highlighting why those stereotypes exist?
I think the question of whether Othello is racist or not is is intrinsic to the play. So the important questions about Shakespeare are real questions. They can't be answered yes or no, because it's the question that's the answer. That the play can be and has had a history of being racist, can be used to sort of frame racism and work in a kind of anti-racist way. So yeah, both are there in the play.
Great. Another question we've had is, sorry, I'm just finding them up on our chat. Oh, should Shakespeare's work be censored or edited for sensitive topics such as racism or anti-Semitism? or is it important to preserve the original text for historical or artistic value?
I don't think it's important to preserve the historical text for any reason, actually. I think if you're talking about in performance, preserving the historical text is the job of editions and the page, but I don't think it's important to preserve any of that in performance if you have a sense that it will work better without that. I think it's difficult to take out race as an issue from Othello or anti-Semitism as an issue from Merchant of Venice, but it is quite easy to take out a phrase like "wash the Ethiop white," which is just a kind of piece of casual racism, which doesn't add actually to anything at that moment in Much Ado About Nothing. And I think unless you want to do something with it, it's better for it not to be there. So I don't think we owe anything to Shakespeare, and I certainly don't think we owe kind of faithfulness to Shakespeare. Shakespeare's not our partner. Faithfulness is a relationship of emotional sort of trust between people. It's not a relationship between a text and its interpretations. I think it's the wrong kind of language for that.
Yeah, in a similar vein, we have a question which is, do you think Shakespeare has to be performed rather than read to be understood in the way he intended?
Yeah, it's interesting that a lot of these questions, I'm less, in certain ways, I'm much less opinionated perhaps than you are expecting me to be, because I think probably it should be both. I think there are, it's not absolutely true to say that Shakespeare necessarily only intended his plays to be performed. One argument is that longer versions in print were intended for readers, and we certainly know that Shakespeare is getting readers within 2 or 3 years of beginning as a playwright. His plays are being published, so there are always readers. If plays weren't preserved for readers, we wouldn't have them. So these are important kind of documents. So I think either. I think you can spend more time with things. You can spend more time understanding things. I can often get a lot of pleasure out of reading. Sometimes reading can be very difficult to work out what's going on. But performance is not the actual silver bullet about Shakespeare. Shakespeare performances can be very boring. I think surely we've all been there and done that. I think Shakespeare can be deeply boring in the theatre. So it needs to be done well. Performance isn't just a good thing. Good performance is a fantastic thing.
Yeah, I agree, and it's really refreshing to hear academics say that. So thank you. Someone has asked, do you have a personal favourite Shakespeare play?
I don't know if I do, actually. No, I don't think I do. I can tend to get sort of interested in whatever I'm working on. I've been working recently on Merry Wives of Windsor, which is a play I didn't really know before and didn't feel very strongly about, and I've really come to really enjoy that. So I don't think I do have a favorite, but I do not like As You Like It. So maybe I can have a not favorite.
Yeah, on the writing process itself, what was the writing process like for you? Did you ever get writer's block? Someone asks.
Not on the Shakespeare book, because it's stuff I know and I've been talking about, and I had the lectures underlying it. So I felt as if that was a very, very easy book, very fun and enjoyable book for me to write. But certainly, yeah, on other writing projects, lots of them usually thinking about, what am I trying to say, and what's the best form, what's the best form in which to say that, and where do I need to start, in a way? How far back do I need to go, or can I just start in the middle? So yeah, I'm very, very familiar with that, but I didn't find the Shakespeare book hard to write.
Thanks. We've got a question from Francesca, which is, considering the demographic of most audience members at the Globe and theatres in general, how can we, as English students or young people, challenge the idea that reading, watching, enjoying Shakespeare is exclusively white and, I'd say, middle or upper class?
Yeah, it's an really interesting question, Francesca. I'm not sure that the demographic of the Globe is quite the same as theatre in general. And the Globe has a much younger audience and a much more first-time audience than just about any other theatre of any sort in the UK. I think in some ways it's back to Luke's question about casting. When I have been at productions which have prominently cast a more diverse cast, particularly a kind of Black British cast or a British Asian cast, that has really transformed the audience. So people need to feel that these plays, speak to them and speak from them. So that's that's all connected with what we were talking about, before. I mean, theatre is pretty middle class in general, so that's not exactly Shakespeare's only Shakespeare's fault. So I think it's about amplifying and amplifying those versions of Shakespeare which are not absolutely white in particular.
We have a more topical question about sort of the teaching of English more broadly, which is that pupils in England will now study maths up to 18 is the plan under Rishi Sunak. What are your thoughts on if there should be similar initiatives to make English compulsory up to the age of 18 beyond GCSE?
So I think the British school curriculum is too narrow too soon. I mean, I'm a product of that myself, and I think it would have been good for me through my life if I had had a broader education beyond 16. There won't be compulsory maths because there aren't enough maths teachers. So it's a kind of non-issue. I think the problem, again, I'm not an expert in this area, but everybody I meet in schools tells me that the problem in schools, in the teaching of English in schools, is the English literature GCSE, which everyone seems to acknowledge is boring. And therefore, it does not encourage students to take it on, to take it further. And we're seeing a massive drop in the number of students taking A-level English literature through a number of different kinds of pressures. So there is a problem there. Back to Francesca's point about the theatres. I mean, in some ways, I worry that English departments are going to become exclusively white and middle and upper class. Having been like that, and possibly with a small period where they began to be more diverse. So I think there is a problem there, but I'm not sure it's about necessarily about making it compulsory, which I think probably won't happen. But it's probably about improving the pipeline so that the GCSE isn't a complete turn-off.
Yes, I completely agree. I always loved English. Classic personal statement opener there. But I always loved English, but I do remember my English teacher just pleading with the class going, it gets better at A-level, I promise it gets better. But it's I guess a shame the way it's set up currently. Yeah, and I do think sadly the way policies are, students have been diverted a bit away from the humanities, so I hope something changes there. Yes, I think that was our last question from the Q&A, and I just also wanted to say it's been so lovely talking to you. And on a quick note, I mentioned in passing to one of my lecturers that I would be interviewing today because I was very excited about it, and he mentioned that he was once your student, so he wanted me to shout him out. That was Daniel Blank.
Yeah, he was in touch with me. Yeah, I'm very glad that he's your tutor. So yeah, thanks so much everybody for your time today, and thanks for preparing the questions, Luke and Sarah, and for everybody else, much appreciated.
Thank you so much. It's been a real honor to have you speak with us. And just for people listening, we have a Writer Summit event tomorrow with book talker Ben Mercer, and then we also have an event next week with Brian Wong, who's a serial commentator for various newspapers and founder of the Political Review. But no, thank you so much, Sarah, for guest interviewing, and thank you so much, Emma. Thank you so much. Have a good evening, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.